The exporter's bank will then advise the letter of credit to the exporter. There is one additional step. A lot of times the importer's bank's credit may not be that good. So you might want to ask for a confirmed letter of credit. A confirmed letter of credit means that your importer's credit is not on the line. The importer's bank's credit is not on the line. You are actually asking a U.S. bank to confirm or put their credit on the line in order to pay you. Typically, confirmations are very expensive, depending on the country that you're asking for. You wouldn't want to ask for a confirmed letter of credit from Switzerland, but you might want to ask for a confirmed letter of credit from Nigeria. A confirmed letter of credit from Nigeria is going to be very expensive. So, just as a consideration, if you ask for a confirmed letter of credit, it will cost you. Now, can you determine the cost of a letter of credit in advance? Every time a banker touches a piece of paper, you hear this noise. Cha-ching! So, what do bankers do with letters of credit? They charge advising fees, they charge confirmation fees, they charge amendment fees, they charge discrepancy fees, they charge examination fees, they charge wire transfer fees, they charge courier fees, and just because I said so fees. Every time a bank touches a letter of credit, they charge for that. Banks are not in business not to charge for letters of credit. You have no way of knowing in advance how many amendments are going to be required, how many discrepancies you're going to have, or if you're going to have discrepancies. Or how many banks are going to be involved. So it's very, very difficult when you're quoting under a letter of credit to know the exact cost of a letter of credit. It's like a big black hole that money goes into, depending on the number of banks, the number of amendments, number of discrepancies, and the bank charges. Now, is it a guarantee to the exporter? Is a letter of credit a guarantee of payment to the exporter? I will say to you that almost 80% of letters of credit have discrepancies. One discrepancy nullifies the letter of credit. That means that the U.S. bank, if it's confirmed, or the foreign bank, if it's not confirmed, has no responsibility to pay the exporter under the letter of credit. The reason there are so many discrepancies is because, number one, letters of credit are complicated instruments that require expertise when you're dealing with them. Another reason is because it's not just the exporter preparing the documentation. The documentation is also prepared by the freight forwarder, a very important document, the bill of lading, whether it's an airway bill or an ocean bill of lading. Freight forwarders are not international bankers. They do a wonderful job at moving freight. However, they don't necessarily do a wonderful job with letters of credit. So if your freight forwarder understands letters of credit, then you have a freight forwarder who's worth his weight in gold. But if your freight forwarder is a wonderful freight forwarder but has no idea about letters of credit, you can count on having a discrepancy. A lot of times it's not the freight forwarder's fault that there's a discrepancy. For example, if you have a latest shipment date and there is a backup of containers, in other words, you can't get space aboard a container, you make a booking, you send your product to the port, but there's no space available, although you did have a booking, you got bumped. You have got a latest shipment date that just expired. You have to make a decision at that point whether you're going to ship on the next vessel against a letter of credit that has a discrepancy, therefore opening the door for your buyer not to pay you, or are you going to store your goods at the port while your buyer goes to his bank to get an amendment, which then comes to your bank, which then comes to you. So a lot of times it's not the freight forwarder's fault. It's the fact that there's no space available, you have a latest shipment date, and you have to make a decision whether to ship with a discrepancy or whether to wait for the amendment. you need to remember that letters of credit are under the Uniform Customs and Practices UCP 600. That protects banks. It does not protect exporters, and it does not protect importers. Banks are very important in international trade. Letters of credit are very important in international trade. But banks will not issue letters of credit if they perceive it to be a risk. So these laws are written to protect banks. And every exporter that deals with letters of credit must be familiar with this UCP. In current economic conditions, we don't always know how safe a bank is. And in fact, for the first time in the history of banking, there are some foreign banks that will not confirm letters of credit on U.S. banks because we've had so many banks that closed up this year. When big banks like Wachovia get in trouble, then banks overseas get nervous when they're asked to confirm. So it's a different world than it used to be. So how does a letter of credit benefit the importer? The importer at least knows something was shipped because the importer will have a bill of lading that says something was shipped. The commercial invoice will describe the product that has been purchased. Now remember, I said that freight forwarders are not bankers. Bankers are not freight forwarders. What I mean by that is the bankers are going to look at the documents. They are going to compare the documents to the bill of lading, to the letter of credit. Bankers are not going to go down to the port, open the container, and see if the goods described in the documents are actually in the container. So freight forwarders deal with the freight, bankers deal with the documents. They definitely cross, but they don't do the same thing. So for an importer, at least they know something is shipped, although it may not be exactly what they had ordered. So what happens when a letter of credit has a discrepancy? Well, if a letter of credit has a discrepancy, it is no longer a letter of credit because it frees everyone from the obligation to pay. So the exporter with a discrepancy must contact the importer immediately and ask for permission to pay. The importer will then notify the importer's bank that there will be a discrepancy and please accept the discrepancy. When there is a discrepancy in a letter of credit, the letter of credit is no longer a letter of credit. It becomes a documentary collection. What your banker will say is, we will have to wire for approval to pay, or we'll have to send the documents for approval to pay. When that happens, the letter of credit becomes a documentary collection. Documents will be sent upon approval. Now, we're going to move to the next step, which is option 3, the documentary collection. My philosophy is if 80% of letters of credit are going to become documentary collections and you don't know how much a letter of credit is going to cost, why not use a documentary collection, which you know will cost $100? So let's look at a documentary collection and how different it is from a letter of credit. Under a documentary collection, the exporter sends the goods to the importer. The exporter sends the documents to the importer's bank. The importer's bank contacts the importer, who comes in, brings the money, and pays.